During spring break last week, I spent time reading the new Elon Musk biography written by Walter Isaacson. And part of the reason why I think I was drawn to read this book is that many would say that Elon Musk is one of the sort of great persons of our age, and that surely from certain categories, he most definitely must be considered that. If you think about it just from like an entrepreneurial point of view, it's pretty staggering. He has some part in starting PayPal and Tesla, SpaceX, OpenAI, Solar City, The Boring Company, Neuralink, and many others. It's really an incredible sort of entrepreneurial record. As far as from an influencer point of view, he currently owns the social media platform X, which used to be known as Twitter, and he's the most followed person on that platform with some 179 million followers. That's a crazy number, 179 million followers. His views on lots of things like colonizing Mars and repopulating the Earth and free speech and clean energy are highly influential. Lots of people know them, and even if they don't agree, they certainly know what he thinks. And there's lots of debate about that. And in many ways, you might even be able to say that Elon Musk is kind of his own brand. Like he's a known quantity, a brand that sort of people understand and recognize. And so for those reasons, I was drawn to read this biography. I was just interested. I don't know if I was 600 pages interested in, but I was definitely interested. And by the time I got to the end, I spent last week, among other things, reading that book. And part of me was like, why, Lord? Why did I spend all this time reading this 600 pages? Well, when I got back this week and saw the passage that the Lord has for us to think about today, I realized, oh, that was not an accident. That was the Lord's timing. Because at first glance, you might not think that Elon Musk and the Pharisees and the teachers of the law have anything in common. But if you're willing to consider in Jesus' day, the sort of great men that the culture thought were the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. They were the influencers of the day, and that people followed them. They sort of hung on their every word. People wanted to know what they thought and what they did. And in many ways, the Pharisees kind of had their own brand, and it was a well-respected brand until Jesus showed up and showed sort of the emptiness of their way of thinking and their way of life. And then in many ways, what we're going to look at in Matthew 23, when we get there in just a moment, is what appears to be a criticism that Jesus has of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, but I actually think there's something much broader going on there. It's a criticism of the culture of what we might call sort of influence or influencers, the culture of branding, the culture of social media, this sort of idea of how we present ourselves to others, a culture that Elon Musk really helped create and also represents. But this morning, we're not really talking about Elon Musk, and we're not actually really talking about the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. What we're talking about is the culture that we live in, the culture that gave rise to someone like Elon Musk. It's a very similar culture to what Jesus is criticizing in Matthew 23. And so we have the opportunity this morning to take a look at the culture in which we all live and operate and hear what it is Jesus has to say about it, helping us to see some of the problems with the culture in which we live. But because it's Jesus, we're not just here to critique the culture. We have an opportunity to hear from Jesus how he wants to bless and care for us in the midst of the culture in which we live. How you and I can flourish in the culture of today. So let me invite you to take a Bible and turn to the book of Matthew, chapter 23. Matthew chapter 23. If you're using one of the church Bibles, it is page 804 and also 805. Matthew chapter 23. We're looking at the whole chapter today, which is 39 verses, and so we're not going to read straight through it. There's too many verses to do that. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of dip in and out and look at specific parts of the chapter at specific times. Before we do, let me give you a couple of just sort of clarifying points as we begin. Number one, I'm not an expert in sort of cultural critique, and I don't know that I could define for you precisely exactly the aspect of our culture that I think Jesus is getting at. But suffice it to say that somewhere in between the intersection of social media and influencer marketing and brand management, those ideas, that's what we're talking about this morning. There's other aspects to our culture, but specifically we're focusing on these ideas represented by social media, by the fact that we have influencers in our culture, that people are looking to these influencers, the fact that we like to have brands and sort of promote different ideas of who we are and who we think we ought to be. A person who's better at cultural critique could give you a word for all of that. I don't know what that word is, but it's somewhere in that connectedness of ideas. Is that fair? Are you with me on that? Okay. The second thing to say before we dive into the text is that there is nothing inherently wrong or evil about social media, about influencers, about brands, about any of those kinds of things. If at your company you're working hard to establish a brand, there's nothing wrong with that. If you're on social media, there's nothing inherently evil about that. If you are considered by people to be an influencer, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, the most influential person in human history is Jesus. And so we're not here in any way to condemn social media. We're not here to condemn influencer culture. We're not here to condemn brand marketing. What we are here to recognize is that in those things, in social media, when an influencer culture, there are some dangers that are possible. And the big danger is emphasizing image over substance. That what is presented to others doesn't match what is present in us. And so we have the opportunity as we think about living in a culture that actually is relatively similar to what's going on in Jesus' time with the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. We have a chance to hear Jesus point out to us the dangers of living in such a social media culture. Not condemning the culture, but helping us understand how we can live faithfully in just such a culture as this. Now, the overarching idea in Matthew 23 is that in just such a culture, a social media, influencing, marketing, brand management kind of culture, one of the real dangers is that we overvalue unimportant things. We overvalue unimportant things. There are 3 examples of that in our passage. The first one begins in verse 5. So Matthew 23, verses 5 to 7, page 804. Everything they do, this is speaking of the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, and our culture. Everything they do is done for people to see. You hear that? Everything they do is done for people to see. They make their phylacteries wide and the tassels on their garments long. They love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogues. They love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to be called rabbi by others. The first thing that we are in danger in such a culture of overvaluing is fame, perception, and reputation. Everything the Pharisees and the teachers of the law did, Jesus says, was for others to see. The whole discussion about phylacteries and tassels, what this is saying is basically when they got up in the morning and got dressed, they thought about how are others going to view me in this outfit. They were constantly looking after their reputation, their brand. How were they viewed in the marketplace? Were people respecting them? Did they know who they were? Did they know their name? Did they know their title? If they had social media, you can imagine Jesus saying when they put out a post, they're worried about what everybody's going to think of what they've said or done. The problem with this kind of culture is there is a danger with overemphasizing how we are perceived by others. What's our reputation? How well known are we? How do others think about us? Second danger, verses 16 to 19. Woe to you, blind guides! You say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing, but anyone who swears by the gold of the temple is bound by that oath. You blind fools! Which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? You also say, if anyone swears by the altar, it means nothing, but anyone who swears by the gift on the altar is bound by that oath. You blind men! Which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? One of the sadder stories in the Elon Musk book comes after he's become the world's richest man, hundreds of billions of dollars. His brother Kimball finds himself in some financial trouble and asks Elon for a small amount of money. I mean, large amount of money for me, but small amount of money compared to Elon Musk's wealth. He consults his financial advisor, who tells him his brother is not a good investment, and so he initially turns him down. This is after his brother had mortgaged everything that he had to help keep Tesla afloat when it was first starting. And when you read the book, you get the story, you get the idea that Kimball, his brother, has spent a good portion of his life trying to help Elon get out of the messes that he gets himself into. Well, finally, Kimball calls him up and is like, are you serious? You're not going to help me because you don't think I'm a good financial investment? Now, Walter Isaacson, who wrote the biography, tries to sort of excuse a little bit what Elon Musk does by writing it off as a lack of empathy. But it's not surprising in such a culture as we exist in today, a culture that shaped Elon Musk and that Elon Musk is also shaping, that there would be a danger of overvaluing money and possessions, thinking too highly of the stuff we have. You see, in a culture in which you're trying to think about how everyone perceives you, money and possessions becomes a way of keeping score. It becomes a way of signaling to other people that you are successful, signaling to other people that you've made it, that you have this bank account, you have this kind of car, you have these sorts of things. And Jesus says the danger of a social media, influencer marketing, brand management kind of culture is not only overemphasizing how people perceive us, it's easy to put way too much value in money, possessions, and material goods. There's a third danger. This one's a little bit trickier to see than the first two. It's in verses 23 and 24. Let me read it and then I'll explain what I think the danger is. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give 1/10 of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel. Now, what I think is going on here is the third thing we can often end up overvaluing in just such a social media culture is metrics, measurables, and success. You see, what the Pharisees are doing is literally when they got spices, they counted out the spices in the jar and they took 10% and gave it to God. Jesus says, yeah, that's fine. But you're neglecting the more important matters. You weren't paying any attention to mercy or to justice. Now, why are they so diligent with tithing their spices? Because it's easy to measure. They can show, look at how obedient I am. Faithfulness is tough to measure. It's hard to have a metric for love. But tithing, that's easy to measure. So too in our culture today, we love to measure stuff. We want metrics and we want measurables. Maybe at work you've got sales goals and every day you're confronted with, these are the measurables. This is what I got to do. Again, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I'm just saying the danger is overvaluing such things. A lot of us count our steps and then we send them to somebody else to tell them how many times we stepped today. We have grade point averages. We got batting averages. We keep track of these sorts of things. We know what our Wordle score is and how many streaks, how many days we've gotten it in a row. There's a Fortnite ranking for where we are in the game, and other people can see when we're on the team how good of a player that we are. We like to measure things because Christ-likeness is tough to measure. Steps, easier to measure. And in a culture in which we're trying to present something to other people, there is a danger, not an inherent evil in metrics, but a danger that we can begin to overemphasize things that are measurable over things that have real value. We evaluate churches on attendance and on giving, because those are easy to count. This is what the Pharisees were doing. This is the culture that Jesus is critiquing. And the problem is, he says, when you're in a culture that emphasizes image, often at expense of substance, when you're in a culture that is focused on how everyone perceives you, there is a danger to overvalue things like people's perception, money and possessions, and easily counted things, metrics, measurables, and success. Now, the good news is, Jesus did not just simply bring us here this morning to tell us all the stuff wrong with our culture. He brought us here this morning to give us a solution. And the solution is, first and foremost, not avoiding the culture. That is not Jesus' solution. The goal is not to bury our head in the sand and to wish we lived in a different kind of culture. It's not to sort of bemoan all of the technology. Listen, they don't have nearly as much technology in Matthew 23. They got the same culture. You could try to wish away social media. You could kind of pretend that phones don't exist. You might hope that AI doesn't really exist. That's not the way to do this. Instead, Jesus gives us a different solution. Verses 25 and 26. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, and here comes Jesus' solution. First, clean the inside of the cup and dish, then the outside also will be clean. Verses 27 and 28. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs. You look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. Jesus' solution is not to try to leave the culture, destroy the culture, avoid the culture. Jesus' solution is when you find yourself living in a culture of social media, influencers, brand marketing, when we live in a culture where everybody is doing stuff for others to see, the solution is take care of the inside and the outside will be just fine. Stop focusing on how others perceive you. Stop focusing on external possessions. Stop focusing on metrics and success, and start focusing on character. Start focusing on who you are. This is the most important thing when you live in the culture that we live in. Character matters. And Jesus says when you take care of the inside, then the outside looks good too. The point is not to have the outside look bad. The point is all you do is worry about cleaning up the outside? Let me put it to you this way. This is not saying don't ever post anything on social media. What it is saying is, before you post how fantastic your life is, be honest about how maybe it's not going so well and let the Lord do some cleaning up on what's going on. And then whatever you post or whatever people see, they're able to see something that's true and authentic. And so Jesus' solution is not throw away all your social media. Jesus' solution is not let's get rid of influencers in the culture. Jesus' solution is let's focus on the inside so that the character matches what is being presented. Because after all, remember who is the most influential person in the history of the universe? It's Jesus. But he's not influential because he's carefully cultivated a brand. He's not influential because he's made sure to only show certain aspects of who he is. He's not influential because he makes sure that every selfie has him in the center of it. He's the most influential person in human history because he's the kindest person in human history. He's the most faithful person in human history. He is the most loving person in human history. He is the most wise person in human history. He is the most sacrificial person in human history. The inside matches the outside, and Jesus says if you and I are going to live in just such a culture, we need to focus on the inside and let the outside take care of itself. Now, let's be honest, that's easier said than done. One of the tragedies of the Elon Musk book is that for all of his faux pas, for all of the dumpster fires that he creates with tweets that he sends out at the wrong time, he's not unaware that he's messing things up totally and completely. And when you read the book, there are a number of times that he tries to fix the inside. The tragedy is it doesn't seem to work. There's one story where he so desperately wants to not put anything out on Twitter that's going to just create problems that he locks his phone in the safe overnight. But then unfortunately, he goes and unlocks the safe, gets out the phone, and sends out the tweet. And so the question is, yes, you can say clean up the inside, but if you read a book like this biography of Elon Musk, or if you just know from your own personal experience, that is far easier said than done. Which is why Matthew 23 doesn't end at verse 26. It ends with verses 37 to 39. Now, before we look at those verses, let me set up what Jesus is going to do in those verses by going back to the three things that we can often overvalue in this culture. The first one was in verses 5 to 7. We can overvalue reputation. Look at how Jesus follows that up in verses 8 to 10. But you are not to be called rabbi. They're worried about how everyone views them. He says, you're not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers. And do not call anyone on earth father, for you have one Father, and he is in heaven. Nor are you to be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Messiah. In the midst of the danger of overvaluing reputation and fame and perception, Jesus draws us back to the truth that any glory that we have is reflected glory. It comes from our connection to God. That when we are connected to God, that's when we receive honor. There's nothing inherently wrong with honor. It's honor that you create for yourself versus honor that comes out of your relationship with God. The second danger was overvaluing money and possessions. Jesus says, which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift valuable? Again, Jesus is driving towards the same idea. He's going to explain it in verses 37 to 39. But the idea is the reason why money and possessions are a blessing is because they are gifts to us from God. And when we use them to bless God and to obey God, that's when money and possessions have some value. In the third instance, They're tithing all of their spices. Jesus says, you've neglected the more important matters: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. These are the character traits of God. These are the fruits of the Spirit. All of this is pushing in the direction of what Jesus is going to do in verses 37 and 39 in answer to the question of how does the inside get changed? Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. Look, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Their culture was desolate. Our culture is desolate. It's empty. There's nothing there. When you feel the idea that influencers, you look around, I mean, it's probably no accident that O.J. Simpson just passed away. He was very influential for good and for bad in our culture. His life was a train wreck. Many of the influencers that people are looking to have desolate lives, empty lives. You look around, and in a culture that values how everyone perceives you, you know this. It's super futile to chase after people thinking a lot of you. You can spend all your time trying to be respected by people. It doesn't work. Money and possessions are a futile thing to chase after. We know lots of people, I read a book about one, who has lots and lots of money and an emptiness in life. The culture is desolate. Focusing, we know people who focus, they've got all their steps in order. They've got a Snapchat streak of thousands with people. They've kept up faithfully. They've got high rankings on video games. They have measured everything you can measure, and they are successful and miserable. Jesus is saying when we live in a culture that is focused on these kinds of things, it is desolate. And so what is the answer? Well, you change the inside. How? Through personal relationship with Jesus. The tragedy of Matthew 23 is Jesus came to Jerusalem in the midst of a social media type culture, reached out his hands and said, I'm here not to condemn you, but to love you. And they wouldn't listen. But this is the solution. How does the inside get transformed? How do you become a person who is faithful and just and loving? How do you become a person who doesn't overvalue possessions? How do you become a person who's not worried about their reputation? It's time spent with Jesus. This is why we began the service with, you and I are loved by God. This is the message of Matthew 23. This is how you and I live and flourish in the culture in which we find ourselves. It's to be loved by God. And so what we're going to do in just a moment is we're going to do a little reflection exercise. Because the worst thing that could happen this morning is we could read Matthew 23, listen to all these reflections on culture, think, oh, that's really interesting. I think that's probably true. And then leave here and do nothing with it. This is what they did in Matthew 23. They listened to everything Jesus said and then totally turned him off and went back to trying to impress everybody. So here's what we're going to do this morning is we're going to walk through these three areas: reputation, money, and success. I want you to just take just a minute, and I want you to think through your life in these areas. I'll just kind of ask some prompting questions. The reason we're doing this is because there's nothing inherently evil about reputation or about possessions or about metrics. But it is possible that the culture in which we live is causing us to focus too heavily on those things. And that is the sign to us that we need to spend more time with God. That if you find yourself connecting with some of these areas a little too much, that's totally natural and normal because of the culture in which we live. And the opportunity that we have today is just to kind of take stock of where each of us are at And if it comes out, I think I might be a little bit too focused on material possessions, this is not for condemnation. This is for an encouragement to say that's a sign that what you need is more time with Jesus in your life. More quiet time, more prayer time, more time with Jesus in nature, more time with Jesus in church, more time with Jesus and his people, more time with Jesus. So let's do this exercise together. Again, you can lie to yourself. We're not going to say this out loud. But Jesus already knows the answers to these things. And this is the opportunity. We can do what they did in Matthew 23, which is totally ignore him and think he doesn't know what he's talking about. Or we can honestly come and say, okay, Lord, please help me to take honest stock of what's going on in my life. All right, the first one. Fame, perception, and reputation. How you doing in this area? Tomorrow, when you go back to school, are you already worried about what people are going to think about you? Are you going to walk through the hallways thinking about who's the popular kids and who's not the popular kids? Are you thinking about how are people going to perceive you? Are you worried about how people are going to speak of you on social media or not speak of you on social media? If you're on social media and you regularly post, are you thinking about how people are going to perceive what you've written? Are you wanting to see how much feedback you're going to get? Again, this is not for condemnation. This is for recognition of, you know what? I might be a little too focused on what people think of me. Are you the kind of person who demands people call you by a certain title? Jesus specifically addresses that. You might be too focused on perception, reputation, fame. Are you worried the people around you in your neighborhood or at your workplace or in your family don't fully value your contributions? They're not looking on you the way you would like to be looked on. They're not giving you the kind of honor you think that you deserve. These are signs. There's not a sign that there's something inherently evil happening. It's a sign that what you need is more time with Jesus. More time for Jesus to tell you, look, I love you. It's okay. They may not get you, but I do. They may not understand, but I do. And if you're the kind of person that is too worried about what others think of you, it's an invitation from Jesus. Come spend more time with me. Second area, money and possessions. When was the last time you looked at your bank account? For some of you, the answer may be in minutes rather than in days. Your retirement account, your salary. How much time are you focused on college debt and getting out of debt? Are there things that you're like, if I can just save up enough money to purchase this watch or this phone or this piece of technology or this car, that will cause me to feel happier in life? Are you noticing what kind of shoes you're wearing or the kind of shoes other people are wearing? Are you thinking, I got to dress a certain way because then people are going to respect me, they're going to take me seriously, they're going to see these things in me? Do you find yourself struggling to give away money to help others in need? You think, well, I got to make sure I got enough to take care of myself. Again, this is not for condemnation. This is a self-evaluation. And if you're like, you know what? We live in a culture that overemphasizes these things. It would be no surprise that spending our time in this culture, we might come away with an unhealthy view of money and possessions. And all we're doing this morning is if we're honest enough to say, you know what? I think that might be the case. The response is more time with Jesus. More time letting Jesus say, look, I love you. And if you don't have any money, I still love you. And if you don't have any possessions, I'm going to take care of you. Give that stuff away. I'll be with you. Third area, metrics, measurables, and success. Maybe you work at a workplace where they want to measure everything. That's okay. The goal is not, don't quit your job. But maybe spending all that time in an environment where everything's being measured, you've brought that into the home, you brought that into some other relationships, you brought that into the church, and you're wanting to measure everything everywhere. It's not success if you can't measure it. That might be a sign that the Lord's like, look, we just need to spend a little more time together, you and I. Do you have fitness goals? And look, fitness goals are fantastic, but it's possible to become obsessive about certain numbers. Are you trying to measure all sorts of things? Okay, well, where's my grade point average? Are you fixated on what your grade point average? Again, nothing wrong with a grade point average. But if you're constantly thinking, if my grade point average is this, I'm not getting into college, I got to do this. That's an overemphasis on metrics, measurement, and success. Maybe money fits into this category. Instead of being worried about possessions, you're like, look, this is how much money I got to make for the next 3 years so I can get to this point. I got to measure all of those things. I got to measure how my investments are doing. Again, please, nothing inherently wrong with measuring stuff. But in a culture that is fixated on external stuff, there can be an overemphasis on metrics, measurables, and success. If in the honesty of your heart or the honesty of my heart, we're like, yeah, I think that might be true. I think I'm actually thinking about, when people come to my small group, if more people is better, less people is worse. I got to count all the people that are here. If we're doing that, it's just a sign we need some more time with Jesus. So this is our chance, just between you and the Lord, to be honest. It would be no surprise, living in the culture that we live in, that we find ourselves out of balance in some of these areas. So what we want to do right now, as we kind of close this time, is I ask you, if you're willing, just to close your eyes. You don't need to see the screen anymore. And what I want you to picture in your mind's eye is what Jesus is doing in verse 37. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks. And I'd like you in your mind's eye just to envision Jesus reaching out his arms to you, inviting you to come and spend time with him, inviting you to let him give you a hug. This is Jesus saying to you and over you, I love you. It doesn't matter what people think of you. It doesn't matter cultivating an online presence. That's not what matters. What matters is I love you. And if everybody in the world online thinks you're crazy, it's okay. Money and possessions are not going to make you happy. See Jesus reaching out his hands to you saying, if you lose everything, you'll have me. I will take care of you. That new car, those new shoes, that new phone, that's not going to bring joy. It'll bring a small taste of happiness for a moment. But I love you. I love you. Keeping track of weight goals, fitness goals, sales numbers. Jesus wants you to know, look, if you never sell another product for that company, I will love you. If you never once hit your step goal for the day, I still love you. The tragedy of Matthew 23 is it's not really a condemnation. It's an invitation to embrace Jesus. He's making you and I the same invitation this morning. We can bemoan our culture all we want. We can say, well, I wish it wasn't this way, but it is. Yet in the midst of it, Jesus has come to tell you, to tell me in the quietness of our hearts, I'm inviting you to spend more time with me. I'm inviting you to let go of some of that stuff. Look, you can stop posting on social media for a month. Come spend the time with me. Look, you can stop thinking about that college debt for a month. Come spend time with me. Look, you don't have to buy any new possessions for a month. You can spend that time with me. It's an invitation from Jesus because he wants you to know you are loved. And there is nothing you will ever do or this culture will ever do to separate you from the love that God has for you. You are wholly and completely loved. One of the sad things in the Elon Musk biography was that when you read the first part of the story, you get the sense that he probably is who he is in part because his dad was so verbally, physically, and emotionally abusive to him as a child. If we're honest, all of us have experienced that kind of abuse in one way or another. This morning, your Heavenly Father wants to change that. He wants you to know you don't have to try to please a parent. You don't have to try to please a boss. You don't have to try to please a culture. You don't even have to try to please yourself. You just need to be loved, to know that you're loved.